So, getting back to the sermon before I forget. So, taking a look at James chapter 2, we're going to take a look at the first section. I'll be really honest, when I first kind of laid out the James series, I was tempted to sort of skip this part. Not because it's difficult, but because I don't think it's something that we typically struggle with, but at least not in this church, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Because the more I thought about it, the more I studied it, the more I felt we should. So, starting in verse 1, it says, "My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism." Favoritism, I think for me, I've always been confused, because like when I think of favoritism, I often think of playing favorites. That's kind of how I view favoritism. And I think as somebody, as a coach, as somebody who's involved in a lot of facets of the community in terms of those things, it's really easy to be accused of playing favorites sometimes. And so I've kind of always thought of favoritism and playing favorites as really being the same thing, but it's actually not. The more I study it, the more I begin to understand it, is for me, I've always been, if you work hard, I'm going to be on your side. I tell people all the time, if you're going to ask me to choose between the person who's working hard, who might be terribly flawed, and the person who isn't working hard, who might not be flawed at all, I will take the terribly flawed, hard-working person. Run into that all the time. When it comes to young people and people that I coach, I always take the one who works hard. I don't care if he's as talented or not as somebody else. I will always take the one who works hard. It's just kind of how I view it. I don't, and every kid who works with me knows that. I've had conversations with parents during, after games who are like, "How come my kid didn't play more?" And I say, "Your kid played as much as they deserved, as much as they earned. I'm sorry, if this other kid works 10 times harder and might be as third as talented, but I'm going to play him." And so I've always thought of that as being sort of what James is talking about here in terms of favoritism. But actually, favoritism in this area is actually defined as a practice of giving unfair preferential treatment to one person or a group, but it comes at the expense of another. So the idea that you have to basically take something, you have to, in order to sort of elevate somebody, you have to discriminate against somebody, is kind of what James is saying here. In the church, we should never get in the habit of elevating one particular group and discriminating against another. So focusing on that idea of at the expense of another, we have to walk away from opportunities where we basically are encouraging discrimination in the church because, with the goal of elevating somebody else. So in the church, I was thinking favoritism in the church, historically, we have looked at it as basically our kind of people. The church has always kind of had our kind of people, depending on where you go to church, right? Because it's not the same everywhere. But the church kind of has their kind of people. People who look like us, people who act like us, people who talk like us. We tend to favor people like that. We tend not to we tend to discriminate against those who basically aren't like us, who don't look like us, who don't talk like us, who don't communicate in the same way. Churches, we discriminate all the time. We have that group of church folk over there, they're a little bit crazier. They got they burn candles and, wave flags and dance in the aisles. But we have certain things where we sort of will discriminate and we will elevate based on favoritism. The church has a terrible track record on race, on socioeconomic issues, on all kinds of things, right? We can acknowledge it, don't worry. It doesn't mean you're racist if you acknowledge it, right? But we do. We have a terrible track record in terms of how we view things. I worked in Texas for a long time. Trust me, the South has a terrible history of how they deal in church. Now I'm talking in church, not politically. In churches about how they deal with socioeconomic classes, class warfare, race, right? We have all kinds of issues. So the church has that. We tend to, congregate with people who look like us. Most churches kind of end up basically all sort of blending. Everybody basically looks. So we sort of elevate people that basically fit our model. Most of us, when I say, what do you think of when you think in terms of the best, most on fire, awesome, mature Christian, you have a mindset of how that person looks, and the chances are they look a whole lot like you. Just more mature, spiritually, right? So we have this favoritism. We show favoritism to family in the church. We show favoritism to longtime members versus newcomers. If you grew up in the church, trust me, that was a big one, right? Old brother Bob's been here for 45 years, so his opinion is obviously way more relevant than yours, Mr. Guy, just got saved guy, right? We have always elevated and basically shown favoritism and discrimination in the church based on all kinds of things that we have decided are sort of godly and right. We basically look at political belief structures. We decide we're going to elevate certain people based on your political beliefs. If a pastor comes out, tomorrow and he's like, hey, Democrats rule, we're like, yeah, okay, whatever. You're out. You've been discriminated against, right? Because we have decided one party is different from the other party, or basically depending on where we live. We have all kinds of things, favoritisms that we show. We have a certain understanding of how we want it to look. We try to fight it off, and I think most of us hopefully have learned to not embrace that fact. But James is going to go into basically a good analogy. He says, suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing the fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there or sit at my feet, have you not discriminated amongst yourselves and become judges with your evil thoughts? So he says, have you not become judges with your evil thoughts? A few weeks ago we talked about temptation. We talked about how in temptation we commit to the decision to give in to temptation long before we're ever even tempted. We make an understanding with ourselves that says, I'm going to do this if the opportunity ever presents itself. Now maybe we don't sign the contract mentally just like that, but we do. We make a decision that says, I'm going to let this happen if this opportunity ever presents itself. What James is saying here is you have become, your evil thoughts basically give you away. That when you view someone with wealth differently than you view someone who is impoverished, then basically your evil thoughts are just giving way to what you already believe, which is we're going to do everything we can to care for the rich man and do really nothing to care for the poor man. When I was a kid, at the church I grew up at, we were a pretty poor church. We were mostly blue-collar types, construction workers, contractors, telephone company repairmen. Got like 3 of those guys. But we had this one guy who came to our church. His name was Jerry. I'm going to say what his last name is. Jerry had a lot of money. Jerry was awesome. I was jealous. Jerry had great hair, right? He did. He had locks, right? Drove a Corvette, so you knew he was wealthy, right? Because nobody drives a Corvette this money. And he had all this stuff. He had the gold rings. He had the shirt unbuttoned down here, coming to church with the gold chains, the man chest. Oh, it was fantastic. Let's just say he walked in, I'm like, one day, I'm going to walk into church just like that. Right? He had the sport coat, but the shirt unbuttoned. Oh, good look. Right? He had the sweet brown leather shoes. You guys know that look, right? 1985? I was impressed. Jerry impressed me. He just, he had so much money. And it was amazing how much, even I viewed him differently as a kid. Because he walked in, his fingers clanking together. Just Dad, what is that? My dad's like, it's an idiot. I was like, what do you know, poor man? Jerry's money, right? I viewed Jerry differently. I was a kid. I was probably Marcus's age at the time. He was probably 11 or 12. But he looked so rich and so amazing. I just wanted to hang out with him, and hopefully, money would just fall out of his pocket. But I wanted to care for him. I wanted to whatever Jerry needs. We got to make sure that he starts pouring some cash into the youth ministry, right? I'm going to take Jerry to lunch because the pastor obviously doesn't care. He's got money, so I'm going to take him to lunch. But it was just a desire to treat him differently from me. And I don't, to my knowledge, I don't know that Jerry ever did a thing at the church. He never came to a work day, probably sent some workers. But, never came to a work day, never was a part of the remodel stuff we did at the church, but every Sunday he'd find that one spot where he sat every week and just exude cash. And then, but it's like as I got older, the longer I was in church, the more I realized the value of what everybody else brought was way beyond anything that he ever brought. But I remember that desire to sort of make way for him. That desire to sort of, make sure that he didn't want to leave the church. I don't remember ever feeling that way as a child growing up about someone who walked into the church looking impoverished. I don't remember ever as a child looking at someone who walked into church looking like a, below average income type person and thinking, I got to make sure that person stays. But I was a child. I was immature at the time. But that was how I felt. And it was really common, like I said, because to me, it's just, no one had to tell me that money was awesome when I was a kid. I knew money was awesome because I never had enough of it. And so, James is saying, listen, when you kind of give way to those evil thoughts, when you sort of accept that, and you allow those assumptions about how people are based on status, based on, how they live their lives, whatever, when you allow those are akin to evil thinking. When you desire to elevate somebody and discriminate against another, that is an evil thought. And James gets into what that means here in just a second. But we basically are giving into our human nature. We're giving into our evil thinking. And it's dangerous to assume that. Moses was an orphan that really didn't connect with either side. When you talk about Moses, remember that he was orphaned, right? Thrown in a basket, sent down the river, right? Anybody? You guys have the picture Bible, right? Mom tearing up and throwing him in the basket. But think about his life growing up. He was never an Egyptian, right? So he was always sort of Egyptian, but not really. And he wasn't an Israelite because he was raised as an Egyptian. So he never really had a place of belonging. So everywhere he went, he was always half of what they really wanted him to be. Yet God uses him. Jesus was born impoverished and really was conceived out of wedlock. But yet, it was easy for him to be dismissed because of where he came from. How many of us have things in our life that if everybody in this room were to find out, would allow them to develop certain assumptions about the kind of person we are? If we bared all of our crudola, right, and we threw it all out on the table and said, here is my stuff, how many people in this room, how many of us know that people in this room would suddenly be able to form an assumption about us? We might profess difference. Oh, I've done some evil things. Well, I'm not an evil person, right? But how many of us, the difference is, what James is talking about is we can see it. So we make an assumption. But we don't really know. They're no different than we are. And James gets into that in just a second. They're no different than we are. I have professed a certain belief in how we are as people. That if we see it, it requires a different response from us than just hearing or just maybe knowing something. And it really kind of played out with the Ray Rice situation, the domestic violence against his fiancée. Nothing happened there that hasn't happened 1,000 times in every professional sport in the last 50 years. Except one thing. We saw it. Right? It's amazing how quickly we don't care if we can't see the difference. But when we see the difference, it's amazing. Suddenly we were outraged. As a country, right? We're outraged. But it happens every week. To anybody who watches sports and follows ESPN, CBS Sports, NFL.com, ESPN.com, Hardball Dogs, whatever. Anybody who watches everything, like me, it happens every week. And the reality is, the difference in who we are is our outrage only came when we saw it. And what James is saying is when our eyes deceive us, our evil thoughts, the truth about how we really feel comes out. So when a rich man walks in the room with his rings clanking together and a poor man walks into the room with the rags hanging off, we make an assumption that requires action because we've seen it. The truth is, what James is saying is, listen, you can't assume there's no difference between the two of them. And he gets into that in just a second, but there's no difference between the two of them. So James says in verse 5, he says, listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen these who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? A little bit of a side note that James is making here. This is not his point, but he reaches for an interesting point. He says, listen, you're groveling at the feet of people who are trying to take from you. He says, why are you groveling at the feet of those who are persecuting you anyway? You're running around after the rich and you're like, let's make sure we make the rich happy. But the reality is, he goes, aren't the rich the ones who are taking from you anyway? it's really pretty remarkable, because, you see people all the time who's like, it's not a big deal, or, I don't understand. But then all of a sudden, like, they get a chance to meet their hero, or they get a chance to meet somebody who's really famous or something, and you see how they just fall apart no matter how cool and how much they might blow off power or blow off fame. I mean, I'm that way. I got to meet John Krug, and I'm like, what's a big deal? He's just a fat guy like me. But then I got to, you guys are like John Krug? Trust me. Awesome. Anyway, and I didn't know what to say. I walked up, I was like, hey. I make my living with talking. It's coming out. But, I got a chance to meet him. And that's what, James is saying. He's like, look, the reality is, you guys are running to care for people who couldn't care less about you. They just don't care. When you got the poor person who's sitting over there going, I just want somebody to care about me. The rich person's looking at you going, I don't care if you like me or not. But you're running to the feet of people who don't even really want relationship with you to begin with. But here you are groveling at their feet, setting the nicest chair for them, going out of your way. But that's kind of how we are. That's why James calls them evil thoughts, right? That's how we are as people. We go out of our way to serve celebrity. We go out of our way to serve fame. We go out of our way to serve, basically wealth. But in the end, it's like, we'll still turn right around when they walk out the door and go, I don't know what the big deal is. But you went out of your way to make them happy. You went out of your way to care for them at the expense of the poor, at the expense of other people. You went out of your way, church in America, to care for these people when the truth is, the ones I put in your charge, you ignored. The ones I put in your charge, but yet you're running around chasing affluence. Christ loves the poor, and if we profess to want to be like him, why would we discriminate against the poor? The ones that he likes the most, we tend to discriminate against. The ones who he loved more than anything are the ones that we are most often willing to dismiss without a second thought. Because we're trying to chase after a resource. We're chasing after, the chance to get to know somebody who's of celebrity and affluence and power. And then James says, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. All right, so this is where we start getting back to James being James. So he's setting a point here that we'll finish in just a few verses, but he's setting a point here where he says, look, if you break the law, you're a lawbreaker. If you run a stop sign, you are a lawbreaker. Now, in our head, how do we justify it? The little law. But you're a lawbreaker. If you speed, you're a lawbreaker. If you cheat or bend on your taxes, that's right. Look at me. You're a lawbreaker. That's what James is saying. He's saying, listen, everybody in the church, all of you holier, righteouser, than thou, or whatever, all you people who think you got it good and yours don't stink, if you've ever made any mistake at all, you're a lawbreaker. Which means all those mistakes, you don't get to stop at the next 45 stop signs and make up for the one you ran. Right? They don't care. What are you? You're a lawbreaker. Everybody in this room, you've broken the law. Everybody. And I don't even know, I don't have to know specifics, but I know it's true. I break the law repeatedly right next to my house. Because they put a completely meaningless stop sign next to my house. I'm not joking. It's one of those stop signs where I was like, really? What? The guy's nailing it in, going, just think of Roscoe, Dukes of Hazzard, hiding behind, ready to jump out of the bushes. That's what it is. But the reality is, we are lawbreakers. Everybody who has ever broken the law, which is everybody in this room, you are a lawbreaker. If you've ever downloaded a song without paying for it, you are a federal lawbreaker. And that's right, you're going to the big house. If you've ever pirated software, that's right, in some countries, that's actually grounds for termination. Right? They will send you out and kill you. Right? The reality is you have broken the law. Everybody in this room has broken the law. Everybody. So the facts are, James is saying, listen, in context of biblical law, for those of you who are groveling at the feet of the rich man and discriminating against the poor man, I want you to remember something. Everybody's a lawbreaker. Everybody has committed a crime. He says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. Why? Because in terms of biblical context, you are no longer righteous. You cannot be righteous and have sinned. It's a bummer deal. Right? I like James. He doesn't really pull any punches. So he says, listen, if you break a single biblical law, you are now guilty of breaking all of the law, which means you have now earned eternity apart from God. You have now basically succumbed to your sinful nature. No small amount makes it okay. Running the stop sign does not make you a minor lawbreaker in the eyes of God. It makes you a major lawbreaker in the eyes of God. If God, He Himself cannot look upon sin, or He Himself cannot be able to engage in there where we find sin present, any amount, no matter how minuscule we might believe it to be, is enough to basically strip us from eternity with God. So James is saying, if that's everybody who walks in, including those of you who are already inside, is you basically are guilty of breaking the entire law of God. And you are now basically stuck with the punishment for breaking the entire will of God. It would be like running a stop sign, right? And getting the electric chair. That's what it is. You ran a stop sign, and because you ran a biblical stop sign, which is you didn't love all your neighbors, you chose to elevate the rich man and discriminate against the poor man, according to James, you get the chair. You guys, thought the Bible was uplifting, right? But that's what you get. Now, how many of us feel that's fair? Of course we don't. You don't want to raise your hands because you're gutless. But the reality is, all of us feel it's not fair. Right? All of us feel it's not fair. God, that's not fair. And He's like, welcome to the deal. You run a stop sign, you get the chair. Because we've all played favorites. We've all had favoritism. I get the chair for thinking Jerry was cooler than my dad. That's the reality of it. So what James says then is, he says, for he who said, you shall not commit adultery, but also said, you shall not murder, if you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. In other words, you don't get to keep the important commandments nor the small ones and get away with it. You don't get to say, well, I'm not as bad as the guy in the chair next to me. I might have fudged on my taxes a little bit and run a few stop signs, but that guy, he stole money. So therefore, God won't notice how sinful I am because this guy is a disaster. That's not how it works. We don't get to say, well, you know what, I wasn't that bad. I might have told a few lies. I might have disrespected my parents. I might have rebelled a little bit, but I never killed anybody. Therefore, Jesus, you're welcome. That's not how it works. The reality is we're guilty of it all, is what James is saying. He says, listen, you are guilty of breaking the entire law. And so because of that, we all get to be punished accordingly. And so how often in the church do we forget that we are eternal convicts and rush to judgment on those we encounter? How many of us forget that we're like divine ex-cons? Everybody in this room, right? All of us have like the eternal prison tax going on. We've all been there. We're all ex-cons. Everybody in this room has sinned. Everybody in this room has basically done so much awful stuff in our life, we deserve to have the book thrown at us and sent up the river forever. All of us. Everybody in this room has basically, all of our hard work, everything we put in, has basically earned us that opportunity. See, when people talk about how James talks about, faith without works is dead, which we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, people forget that this is the context for that part of the chapter. Is that James is saying, listen, no amount of perfect holding to, hanging on to the law besides the ones we've broken, basically makes you now innocent of the mistakes you've made. Now, I always tell people in our country, we talk about justice all the time, but we don't have a justice system in this country. We have a fairness system. There's a difference. You commit a crime, we want to know why. We do. Because the why helps us understand the crime and will either make us hate you more or like you more. If someone commits a horrible atrocity and we go, but they had a horrible childhood, they would do this, they would do that, we always kind of go like, what? Oh, doesn't make any difference eternally. In terms of why you broke the law of God, God doesn't go, well, in all fairness, that was a tough decision. You gotta look at it that way, right? We get that? So we have a fairness system. We have lady fairness, right? We don't have lady justice in this country. We have to call it justice because it sounds more American, but the truth is it's lady fairness. So we work very hard to understand and embrace fairness, but in terms of how the law of God works, you run that stop sign, you basically have now earned death. That's not fair, but that's just. See, real justice says it doesn't matter why. You commit the crime, you pay the price. And so for a lot of us, we forget that we have committed the crime. Everybody in this room has lied. More than likely in the last 48 hours. Right? I mean, we might say it was a small little lie to make somebody feel better. But it was a lie.
Consider it a lie?
Oh yeah. It's just our way of shortening up the truth. Right? We've had lies of omission. All of us have continued to commit the grievous acts of illegal Christian activity. All of us. Everybody in this room. But it's amazing how much we allow what we see to change how we feel about it. We see somebody wealthy, we grovel at their feet, we go out of our way. We play favorites based on how we see it to play out. That person looks like a very rich Christian person. Now, I'm not talking about money, but I mean, they look legit. This person over here looks like a very poor Christian person. In other words, obviously the bad decisions are catching up with them. So we want to elevate this person who looks, the part of a good Christian leader. That, when I was younger and I first started out in youth ministry, if you didn't have long hair or goatee and you were kind of overweight, you were not allowed to be a youth pastor. Right? Because those were the 3 prerequisites for being a youth minister. You had to eat more pizza than every kid in the youth group, you had to have some measure of facial hair, and you had to have some kind of long hair that said you were a rebel. Other than that, it didn't matter. You could be tall, short, didn't matter. You had those 3 prerequisites. The reality is you look like a youth pastor, go get them, Tiger. If someone was thin, well put together, well combed, maybe like an executive pastor or worship. Now worship's changed, because now worship you have to have tattoos, you have to have all this. See how it's tough. But the thing is, that we sort of elevate based on look, not substance. We elevate based on how spiritually mature you look. But we forget that no matter how spiritually mature you look, you're still an ex-con. But yet we take people over here who don't look like they're spiritually there. We take people over there and we sort of discriminate against them. And we say, well, you don't really look like us. You don't really look the part. I mean, seriously, if you went to a youth pastor's get-together in 1996, we all looked the same. We did. It was awesome. And every now and then that one weird kind of guy would walk in, you'd be like, whoa. Just can't grow it out yet? Is that all it is? But he's like, yes, but I want to. Like, you're not welcome. Or a girl would walk in, that would really throw the whole thing off. Right? What are you? I'm the youth pastor at my church. No, you're not. Really? You can be a girl, be a youth pastor? But how much pizza can you eat? I mean, there were a lot of things that we had to understand. Right? There were a lot of things that disqualified you. But that's how we do it. We have this understanding of you stand there, you look this part, so I'm going to elevate you, and I'm going to have favoritism because you're kind of what I'm looking for. You kind of fit the part. Instead of dealing with, the reality is that God, we're all ex-cons. We all have mistakes. We all have a terrible, long, law-breaking past. Then God, He's not into the 3 strikes you're out thing. Right? But the facts are that He continues to forgive. And so that's why He says, and this, like I said, this is the context for the faith without works part that we often don't read. In verse 12, He says, speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. I love that. Speak and act like somebody who's going to be judged. Speak and act in your life, in your church, in your ministries, like somebody who's going to be judged. Speak and act like somebody who deserves punishment. There's nothing more frustrating than someone who deserves punishment being defiant. Right? Every parent in the room's like, hallelujah. But there's nothing more frustrating than someone who deserves punishment being defiant. So we're supposed to speak and act like someone who's going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. In verse 13 it says, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. He says in the end, in verse 13, he says, mercy triumphs over judgment. So before James ever gets into what James is most known for, most embraced over, James says that mercy triumphs over judgment. In the end, if we speak and act in our lives like someone who deserves judgment, we will be merciful. If you knew, and if you remembered at all times that how you were going to be judged by your peers is how you judged your peers, wouldn't you be very different? If you know for a fact that the mercy that you show will be the mercy shown you, you would act very differently, wouldn't you? But it's amazing how quickly in our Christendom world that we kind of forget the mercy we've been shown and we forget the stop signs that we ran. But you're the first ones to just want to throw the spiritual hatchet at somebody who runs a stop sign. I live on kind of a through street. The street we live on. And there are people who fly down that street. Crazy fast. Because my street leads you to Roselle if you go out behind Home Depot. So a lot of the Home Depot contractors and stuff, they whip out that way so they can get around and not have to worry about the immense traffic that's in Riverbank. But I know how often I get really upset when they drive by me going super fast. But it's amazing how quickly I totally forget all the times I drive super fast. It's amazing how many times I get mad at somebody for blowing through a stop sign and quickly forget all the times I've blown through a stop sign. It's amazing how fast that I get frustrated with parents who are mad about the way a game goes. When I remember just a few years ago, I could barely stand watching my son play baseball when I wasn't coaching because I was so angry at the coaches. It's amazing how quickly we forget all these things. It's amazing how quickly we judge our neighbors based on what's going on, right? Guy hasn't cut his lawn in like 3 weeks. Is he a savage? Right? Then there's that one time you didn't mow your lawn for like 3 weeks. You're like, I got busy. It happens. Right? But savage. Mine's justified. You don't understand. Right? So it's amazing how quick that we judge people. And we look right past our own garbage and we forget all the stuff that we've done. And we start to have this sort of system of favoritism in the church because everybody that sort of looks like what we want that part to look like is accepted, and people who don't look that part aren't accepted. And so we begin to basically, at the expense of those that we're stepping on, we do our best to get up to those that we want, that we think fit the part. And so what James is saying he's saying, listen, we have to step back and show mercy. In everything that we go through, we have to show mercy. And we have to show mercy to the poor. We have to show mercy to those who are in rags. And it starts with remembering our roots. That's the first and most important thing, is remember you're a convict. Stop acting like you're not. It's a good thing to remember the fact that you have been saved by grace. That Jesus loved you enough to lay down his life because he had to, because you were such a nasty convict. Remember that. Remember the mistakes. That you've been forgiven. It doesn't hurt. Don't wallow on them, don't dwell on them, don't like, I'm never going to be forgiven. Accept the fact you've been forgiven, embrace it, but the truth is, remember your roots. Second, ask yourselves, who would Jesus run to first based on how you're judging the situation? How many times did Jesus run to the person you think you should go to first versus how many times did he go to the other person? And try to remember which one would he go to and probably choose that one. Think that through. The next thing is fall in love with shifting the paradigm. That's a really, really super smart way of saying change the way society assumes the church is going to act. Change the way the church has always acted. Change the way that the world talks about us. Because, there's a lot of stuff the world says about the church which is just ignorant and stupid. And I'm just going to call it that. That's what it is. It's just stupid. They pretend like it's all, hyper intelligent and really awesome, but the truth is it's stupid. But in the case of this, they do have a very strong case for the fact that we have pandered ourselves so often to those who look the part, and we've forgotten about substance. And we've forgotten about what Jesus cared about. So we have to begin to fall in love with shifting the paradigm, which means have some fun watching people get confused by how you act. Have some fun watching the world go, well, the church is changing. The church doesn't seem to care. And it's because the church shouldn't care. Jesus would not have judged people based on socioeconomic standards. He would not have judged people based on race. It wouldn't matter. Remember to give all the mercy you hope to receive. Next time you encounter an opportunity to call somebody out for the fact that they just blew through a stop sign in your emotional life, step back and go, would I want to go back in time and have everybody whose stop sign I've run through forgive me? Absolutely. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to let it go. I got to say goodbye to that issue. And if you think you don't need mercy, please find another church. I'm just being honest. Wow. If you think you're above mercy, there are some really nice churches that would love to have you. Because you're not. And you're very, very confused. And I'm not really sure we can work with that. Because if you really think you don't need mercy, if you really think that you've never made a mistake, if you really think you're not guilty of what James said, you have a very impressive opinion of yourself and significantly flawed. I'm just being honest. The truth is the church needs to remember the fact it needs mercy. The church needs to remember the fact that we have all made mistakes. Stop judging each other for it. Stop assuming certain people are greater than other people. Stop showing favoritism. Stop acting. We are all guilty of the same stuff. We are all guilty of breaking the entire law of God, and all of us have earned life apart from Him, if not for mercy. So the same mercy that we want Jesus to show us is the same mercy that we need to show each other. And look at each other and say, you know what? It's all good. The church should be the one place where people are okay with saying, man, I made a mistake. Instead, the church, like my mom always says, the church is really good at killing their wounded and eating their young. We're the only entity in the world that's awesome at it. Somebody comes in church wounded, and we're like, kill them. Quickly. Young people have so much energy. Consume them. Fantastic. I don't know why the church is dying. Because we're not healing anybody and we're killing all the young people. That's probably why. The reality is we have to step back and say, man, you know what? Church should be the one place anybody can walk in and go, I dropped the ball. And have everybody go, me too. Instead, the church is that one place where we expect this weird sort of pseudo-perfection. I mean, whenever you see pastors get up and go, I made a mistake, the church is like, well, you have to go. You're a sinner. Go. It's disgusting. You disgust us. Pastors don't make mistakes. I totally do, and I made one recently, and yesterday, and Friday. Probably 2 on Thursday. and the unrighteous animosity I felt toward the child that I wanted to help with a Snickers bar. Probably not. No, I'm not throwing a Snickers bar either. No, but you know what I'm saying? It's one of those things where we all make mistakes, but it's amazing how much we don't feel the freedom to admit it. Because why? Because we favorite the people that are perfect in our head, the people that look the part. You know what I'm saying? We got to move beyond that. The church has got to say we need mercy and we accept mercy. So let's pray, and I'll ask for forgiveness about the child. So you can all hear it and log that away as me being back to work. Father God, I just thank you so much for this morning. And God, I thank you that James points out that we have to show mercy and love and grace and get away from being people who are playing, who have favoritism. Church should never be a place for that kind of sin. So God, I pray that we can be moved to embracing who we are as people and say, man, we are all convicts. We're all mistake makers. We are all sinners. We've all come up short. Everybody in the world, regardless of affluence, power, celebrity, fame, regardless of how we look, present ourselves, the super stout Christian we appear to be or the weak Christian we appear to be. God, we have all made mistakes, and you love us all. God, it is our job to be your hand extended, which means we are not to show favoritism. We're not to prefer this to that or that to this, but we are to embrace everybody as sinners. And God, that we are all in need of mercy, that we can go out this week and basically hand out the mercy we hope to receive. God, I just pray for that. I pray for those opportunities for this group of people. In your name, amen.